want to talk about a very important principle, and it's the principle of integrity. Now, when I say that word, what tends to happen is, and not completely inappropriately, but nevertheless a little bit off what I want to focus on. People hear sort of a moral term, a virtue, and of course integrity is a virtue, and it means something like being true to the principles that you hold are most true. That has tended in our culture to be conflated and confused with authenticity, and I think sometimes when people are saying authenticity, they really mean integrity, because integrity is the virtue that protects you from hypocrisy. Because what you're doing is you're being true to the principles that you hold to be most true. But sometimes authenticity also means this other thing, this sort of romantic notion of being true to your true self, and it's unclear what that is. And there's so I want to put that aside. I have some criticisms of that notion. Many people do these days within sort of philosophical circles. So let's put that aside. We're not talking about authenticity. We're not completely separate from the virtue of integrity. But what I want to do is I want to go from thinking of it just as this virtue to what we need, which are principles of practice, training principles, or as it's put in the tradition that I was taught, we want training precepts that tell us how to properly train. So what is it we're training? And what is this notion of integrity? Well, let's turn it into, instead of the virtue of integrity, let's talk about the process of integration. And we've been practicing this from the beginning. At the end of every sit, I say, okay, slowly come out of your sit or your practice, trying as best you can to integrate what you've cultivated in your practice with your everyday consciousness and cognition. And that your sitting is not a vacation, it's an education for transforming your life. So that process of integrating what you're doing in the practice with the patterns of your life, that's the integrity that we're focusing in on here. We want the patterns in our life and the patterns in our practice to befriend each other. We don't want to be trying to cultivate one set of practice, one set of patterns and principles in our practice, and then live different principles and patterns in our lives, because then they will actually be undermining and in conflict with each other. So the first part of this is, of the integration, is to extend this notion of befriending oneself, so that what we're cultivating in our practice and what we're practicing in our life are in a reciprocal opening, a reciprocal reinforcing, a reciprocal affording relationship. They're befriending each other. That's the first part of what we're trying to do, what is meant by integration. And then if we zero in on that, a more specific meaning is what we're trying to do with the training precepts is we're trying to afford moments of application and transfer. We're building a bridge. And so the point of the precepts is to call out, like, oh, moments where we notice, it's a mindfulness that we can apply our practice to our life. It's like, oh, here's where I could step back and look at. Here's where I could come into centeredness and rootedness. Here is where I could try and get into a more flowing relationship with all the dynamics of what's happening in this situation. So what we're trying to do is we're not only trying to get harmony, and that's important, right? That resonance, but we're also trying to expand it. We're trying to increase the opportunities for where we will apply what we've trained in our practice to our life. We will also thereby do the reverse. We will more and more flag moments of our life as things that get taken into our practice that remind us of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So I want to present the 5 training precepts. Buddhists love numbered lists, the 5 training precepts. And I want to really refocus them and even reformulate their wording to give emphasis to this not being just sort of a vague moral set of commands for getting this sort of not too clear notion of moral integrity. Instead, we want very clear and concrete ways of trying to afford the harmony and trying to afford opportunity. So I'll present the traditional version of the precept and then how I recommend we how we reformulate it and really zero in on the practice of integration. So the first one is do not kill. So the problem with that is it's a command, and then we tend to hear it in terms of obedience to the command, and there's an external rule, and it leaves out a lot of what I was trying to put an emphasis on. So instead of acquiescing or obeying a command, instead, I propose you reformulate it as a promise or a vow that you're making to yourself, because this is the way of creating that befriending. And then also the problem with the traditional version of these precepts is they're all negatively formulated. They only limit what you shouldn't do. They don't actually make you seek opportunity. So I would propose the following. Instead of do not kill, this: I promise not to harm, but to mindfully enhance and enrich life. So what we can note, right, is we can try and throughout our day, because what are we doing in the practice? Well, we're trying to heal, and we're trying to transform, and we're trying to grow. But if we're out in our life and we're harming, and we're limiting, and we're restricting growth, and we're restricting transformation, right, then these things are dissonant with each other. Also, moments where you could, right, actually help somebody, and of course you have to do this mindfully, right, where you could act in such a way as to enhance and enrich life, are moments of opportunity for the application of what you've been doing in your mindfulness practice. Now, I'm not going to tell you the particularities of how to do this, or even the particular ethical framework you might want to bring to bear on that. That is not I do not have that place or that role for you. I'm trying to get you to see how you could extend and integrate what you're cultivating in your practice into your life. So I promise not to harm, but to mindfully enhance and enrich life. So the next one is, do not steal. And again, you may even be able to go through an entire day, especially now, without stealing, even minor stealing, very, very minor stealing. So again, is that going to be that effective? I think we've all been socialized to a significant degree where, at a moral level, where that's largely something we're probably satisfying. But let's turn it around. Let's think about how our relationship to possessions and material objects is something in which co-identification and automatic and reactive behavior is very prevalent. So our relationship to our possessions and to material things is actually a fertile field in which we can plant the seeds of mindfulness. So how about, instead of don't steal, right, is I promise not to use or perhaps relate. I like relate better. Some people like use better. I promise not to relate to material things mindlessly, but mindfully and wisely. So notice the way in which objects are projections of your identity. Notice ways in which material things perhaps are giving you a sense of stability or solidity. And you might want to reflect on that. You might want to note it. You might want to say, why do I want this object near me all the time? Why do I want to control that? And so what you're seeing here, of course, I hope, is that one of the things we can do in the mindfulness is we can periodically, and remember, neither one of these modes is good or bad, but we can periodically shift from a having mode towards material things into a being mode towards material things. Okay. Not only material things. I'm in academia, and so doing this with ideas, especially other people's ideas, is very important. So, for example, I try to be very stringent about giving people credit for their ideas and how they've influenced on me, and try to make it very clear how much other people, right? Anything that I produce has always been produced in concert with other people. So those are the first two. We'll put a description of all of these also in the notes for this video. Okay. So we've got, I promise not to harm, but to mindfully enhance and enrich life. I promise not to use or relate to material things mindlessly, but mindfully and wisely. The next is what I'm doing, which is speech, language. So in traditional form, it's don't lie, and that's that's a challenge to not try to lie through an entire day, even minor lying, and so that in of itself I think is valuable. But I think there's something missing from it. Again, there's a golden opportunity, because there is nothing that is so deeply interwoven with our sense of our humanity and our personhood as language. I mean, the greatest philosophers of the previous century, like Wittgenstein and Heidegger, independently zeroed in on this idea that it's our ability to use language that most distinguishes us as persons from the other organisms on this planet. And then, of course, how we particularly use language is how we spin and weave the autobiography of our own individual person. So, and this has also something that I've seen from the philosophical tradition, especially coming out of Socrates and Plato. One of the most fundamental ways in which we can care for ourselves, care for each other, and care for our humanity is being careful in our speech, taking care of it, caring about it. And that doesn't mean caring that people agree with us. It means paying attention to what's at work in our speech. That sloppy and careless speech, of course, becomes sloppy and careless thought, which becomes sloppy and careless action, which then becomes a sloppy and careless life. Now, I'm being a little over dramatic here because I'm not showing inevitability, but I'm showing a very distinct possibility of progression. So in some traditions, you're not allowed to even engage in idle talk, right? I'm not so sure that might be too strict. I understand that there's important social function of pleasantries, right? Where we're just trying to say we're all in this together, or we're sharing a society and we're just signaling that. But I think it's fair to say that our culture has been especially awash in the abuse of speech and language. And this is a very pertinent and powerful place where we could all bring mindfulness to bear. So, I promise not to speak mindlessly, but mindfully, wisely. So, another thing that's precious coin is, of course, our sexuality. The fourth precept is don't commit adultery. It's not clear that that's even a relevant thing for us, because our notions of relationship and marriage and sex are not bound together the way they were in the traditional culture in which Siddhartha spoke. So instead, right, again, think about how deeply your sexuality weds, right, the sort of the highest levels of your personhood, who and what you are, to sort of the deepest levels of your embodiment, of your biology. Nietzsche famously said that the depths of my sexuality reach up to the height of my spirituality. There's a whole tradition, both within Hinduism and Buddhism, it's an area where they overlap, called Tantra, in which the whole point is to realize the tremendous integrative and also therefore disintegrative power of sexuality. Are you practicing your sexuality in a way that enhances integration, that is a place where you're bringing in mindfulness, where you're bringing in how this deeply taps into areas of your brain that you otherwise do not have access to? Or are you practicing your sexuality in a way that disintegrates you, disintegrates your connections to others, disintegrates your connection to the world? So a lot of what pornography does, of course, is it severs connection. It severs learning because it goes for instant gratification and it goes for the salience of the stimulus as opposed to the meaning of the relation. And so, again, I'm not a prude. I'm not telling you what to do. The point of this precept, and like I said, there's this whole tradition, is this is a place in which we should be bringing the principles of our practice to bear. It also means if we befriend our sexuality with mindfulness, our sexual issues, and all of us have unresolved issues, thank you, Freud, right, can be addressed potentially within a meditative setting. Now, of course, I'm not saying that that's a panacea. Therapy might be needed, other things might be needed. But when we bring this bridge, this is how we can start addressing these issues. So, I promise not to practice sex mindlessly, but mindfully. And think again about, can you come into the being mode and make love as opposed to just having sex? The last one is tricky for our culture. And it's also tricky in sort of cross-cultural ways. So the original form of this is don't use intoxicants. Don't use intoxicants. So some Buddhists take this very seriously. They won't even take like an aspirin, right? And there's a problem with that because our culture is kind of unclear about what we think of intoxication itself. We, of course, think we have moral criticisms of immoral acts or illegal acts committed because of intoxication, but we're unsure as a culture of intoxication itself. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Now, for those of you who are interested, I have videos, both within the series and on my channel, about altered states of consciousness. Okay, and so I'm not going to try and give my argument about what I think is a good way of framing them here, but I do want to say, what does the training precept lead us to? Well, the training precept leads us to this idea. You can see in organisms that have high intelligence that they seek out altered states of consciousness. And in fact, you have an altered state of consciousness every night. You're dreaming. And dreaming seems to be correlated with how complex the cognitive machinery of an organism is. Also, how much the complexity of its social networking. So dreaming, altered states of consciousness, and this seems to be the case for many altered states of consciousness, seem to be conducive to a way in which higher cognition expands and enriches itself. That's why you'll see, Caledonian crows will tumble down a rooftop to make themselves dizzy because they just want to be dizzy, or elephants will eat fermenting food to get kind of stoned, right? Or goats will eat, the coffee beans and get kind of, right? So intelligent organisms pursue altered states of consciousness. It's natural to us, and there's increasing evidence that they're highly functional. Now, precisely because they're highly functional, they shouldn't be abused. All of these things that we're talking about are really important, right? Places, loci, in which your humanity is in question, and how you act there steers it very, very deeply. And so the idea here is, how are you pursuing altered states of consciousness? Because you will. You'll either do it default, automatically, or you'll do it more or more deliberately, but that deliberately might still be in a very risky or ultimately maladaptive way. So think about this. What you're doing right here in this practice is pursuing an altered state of consciousness. So we need to understand this. So the idea here is, again, this is precious coin. You're seeking of altered states of consciousness. So when you're seeking an altered state of consciousness, here's the thing to ask yourself. What's the principle in mindfulness? I'm seeking an altered state of consciousness because I'm not seeking to escape. I'm seeking to educate. I'm seeking to transform myself so that I can be more present, more insightful, and act more wisely, more centered and rooted. When you're pursuing your altered state of consciousness, are you pursuing escape or are you pursuing education and transformation? So, I promise not to abuse altered states of consciousness, but cultivate them mindfully, no pun intended, and wisely. Let's review. Okay. I promise not to harm, but to mindfully enhance and enrich life. I promise to relate to material objects not mindlessly, but mindfully. I promise not to use speech mindlessly, but mindfully. I promise not to practice my sexuality mindlessly, but mindfully. I promise not to abuse altered states of consciousness, but seek out those which educate and transform me. Or I promise to practice altered states of consciousness mindfully. How do we do the precepts? Two ways. Right? And now we'll start incorporating this into all of our sits. So when I say today at the end of our sit, slowly come out of your practice, trying as best you can to integrate what you've cultivated in your practice with your everyday consciousness and cognition, there will be a gap. I will not immediately start answering the questions because in that time, now you're in a state of deep mindfulness, you're in a deep state of presence and receptivity. What you want to do there in order to come out of the practice, in order to create that bridging, is to recite to yourself mindfully the precepts. Maybe just one of them, maybe all five of them. Okay? So just to give you the reminders, the first one's about your material possessions. Sorry, the first one's about life. Second one's about material possessions. Third one's about speech. Fourth one is sexuality. And fifth one is altered states of consciousness. So that's what you do. And then throughout the day, you take it up to try and practice the precepts as a way of harmonizing and bridging between your practice and your life and creating, affording opportunities where you can grow by applying the principles to your life. Okay, so that's a long lesson, but it's an important lesson. So we've been talking about the cultivation of integrity as the process of integration, which I've situated within the framework of befriending yourself. And so I have recommended reformulating the training precepts, the 5 training precepts, as 5 promises that you make to yourself as an act of deep befriending yourself. And then I recommended taking the negative command structure and opening it up into a more comprehensive negative and positive promise. And some of you may recognize this is my attempt to get the idea of the Aristotelian golden mean, how we cultivate virtue properly, into the promises. The idea of the practice of integrity is we're trying to befriend, we're trying to get a harmony between the patterns and processes we're trying to inculcate in our sitting and the patterns and processes by which we govern, regulate, and live our lives. We want them consonant, we want them befriending each other and affording each other so that what I'm cultivating in my practice will be transferred to my life, and what is occurring in my life can be brought into the deep meditative reflectioning of my sit, and thereby I can reciprocally open. I can remember the being mode in a very deep way. And so we think of the training precepts as setting up that process of resonance, and it also is a process by which we are affording opportunity to apply the practices and skills that we're training in this course, and also to celebrate and to remember the Buddha and the Dharma and the Sangha. So just to review, what we do is, of course, we try to live out the promises throughout the day, but at the end of our sit, where I normally say, now, slowly come out of your practice, trying as best you can to integrate what you've cultivated in your practice with your everyday consciousness and cognition. You mindfully recite those promises to yourself with intentionality. You're trying to make a promise the way you would make a promise with integrity, a sincere promise to a friend. So you're making that promise as a way of trying to integrate what you've cultivated in your practice with your everyday consciousness and cognition. So I promise not to harm, but to mindfully enhance and enrich life. I promise not to relate to material objects mindlessly, but mindfully. Perhaps you might want to add remembering the being mode. You could actually add that throughout all precepts, all of these promises, if you find that helpful. I promise not to speak mindlessly, but mindfully. I promise not to practice sexuality mindlessly, but mindfully. I promise not to cultivate altered states of consciousness mindlessly, mindfully, perhaps adding not for escape, but for the cultivation of wisdom. So we're going to go into our sit. When it comes to that point, as the timer will go off, and I'll recite what I always say about coming out of the sit. But then there'll be silence for a bit before I go into addressing some of the Q&A. And in that silence, you have the opportunity, if you so choose, to practice the 5 promises. All right? So please get comfortable. Please make sure you set your phones to do not disturb. And we will begin when I say begin. Begin. Slowly come out of your practice, trying as best you can to integrate what you cultivated in your practice with your everyday consciousness and cognition, perhaps by mindfully and intentionally reciting the 5 promises to yourself.